Okay, it's 7 p.m. We've got a good show on this evening, so we'll just kick off. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. So it's through the Women in Agriculture series, and obviously it's funded by the Farm Advisory Service. And this is part one of a three-part series, which will focus on the whole farm plan, which is coming into force in 2025. So my name is Hazel Laughton. I work out the SAC Consulting office in Lanark, and tonight I am joined by Osla Jamwell-Fraser, who is one of our consultants up in the Shetland office. So she's joining us from the islands this evening. And in the background, I've also got my colleague Keira Sannachan, who is going to be on hand if anybody's experiencing any technical issues, and she'll also be taking your questions for this evening. So on that subject, there is the two options. There's the chat and the Q&A. So we would ask you to put the questions to hosts and panelists, and we'll sit and collate these questions during the webinar. So just put your questions in as you go. And at the end of Osla's presentation, we will come back and revisit the questions and answer as many as we can, within the time. We're hoping to finish within the hour. So with no further ado, I will pass over to Osla, who is going to present to you tonight on the guidance surrounding the whole farm plan and what's required. So welcome, Osla, over to you.
Okay, hello and welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming along. The aims of tonight are really just to give you a bit of an overview of where we're at now and what the guidance is so far that we have clear for the whole farm plan and support moving forwards. What we do already know is that what is now being proposed and where we're at now came out of work done with farmer-led climate change groups. So just as a sort of a caveat to the whole of this, where we're at just now, it really is evidence that we need to engage as a sector. We need to engage with all of these consultations that are still coming out around rural and agricultural support. I know it's a lot of time and effort for a lot of people, but if we do not engage, then other people are making those decisions on our behalf. So take the time to have a look at consultations that are coming out and evaluate really if they are worth engaging in. The good news is that we know from last year's NFU conference that 70% of the budget will remain in direct support in Scotland, differently to England and Wales. That 70% will be spread across tiers 1 and 2, so your basic payment scheme, what we now currently know as LFAS, that we know is going to be staying with us for a little bit longer, and the tier 2 enhanced measures, which we're not entirely sure what they'll look like yet. Nobody is talking yet about tier 3 and tier 4. 30% of the budget will go to those elective and complementary and competitive schemes, but we don't need to worry about them at the moment because we know absolutely nothing about them. Change begins in 2025 with new requirements in place for cross-compliance, and we'll have a quick look at that. That's the GAKE 6 measures. The Scottish Suckler Beef Scheme is seeing some changes coming in from 2025, and also our main topic tonight, the whole farm plan. Cross-compliance that we just mentioned, a lot of people, certainly up here in Shetland, have been a wee bit worried about this new GAKE 6 standard. A lot of people thought perhaps it was going to be much, much different from what we already have. But actually GAKE 6, the Good Agricultural Environmental Condition, these are just measures that are supplementary to things that were already there. And they're about protecting peatlands and wetlands, and they're just a kind of a reinforcement of the GAKE conditions that we were already having to respect, and they prohibit a range of activities on peatland and wetland areas, but those are peatland and wetland areas that are near natural. Okay, so if you have a look at that quote there on the right hand side, we're talking about land where the peat depth is at least 50 centimetres and is associated with semi-natural vegetation or areas of bare peat, as well as wetland habitats on uncultivated or semi-natural land. So if any of you are in the position that a lot of Shetland crofters are, that they're perhaps cutting their best silage field on Region 2 ground that was a 1980s or early 90s reseed, that is not what Gate 6 is looking at. Okay, it's to protect areas that are near natural still. So they're looking at prohibiting ploughing, cultivating, reseeding, new drainage, clearing out existing drainage that causes further damage to peatland, application of pesticides, all of those things on near natural peatland, which I think we can probably all agree is quite a good thing, really. So not anything to get too worried about. Next thing we'll have a quick look at is the suckler beef scheme. The suckler beef scheme is staying with us at the moment. They are bringing in from 2025 a new calving interval. Calf eligibility will be dependent now on the dam's calving interval, and that calving interval must be a maximum per animal of 410 days, or of course if she's a heifer calving for the first time, the first registered calf will be automatically eligible. This will be looked at on a single animal basis. Okay, so it's not your average herd, your herd average, sorry, it's on a single animal. So if you have a cow who is calving out with that 410 days, her calf will not be eligible, but your other cows within the 410 days will be. Okay, you can check your animal performance already on Scott EID and have a look at where you're at. Another good thing to check up on is all the stats that you have on there, but also just have a look at what your targets should be. Think about that in your animal health and welfare planning, which we'll come on to in a wee bit. We know that the threshold may reduce from 410 days further if you bear in mind that in Ireland they are currently working to a 365-day calving interval. We do know that it will not reduce by more than 10 days in any given year. We also already know that for 2025 and 2026, the calving interval will remain at 410 days. It's not going to reduce any further in 2026. Okay, the money for the suckler beef scheme is ring fenced. So although there may be fewer calves claimed, those that are claimed will get a proportion of what money is available. So you may well find that although you don't have quite as many calves eligible for suckler beef scheme support, you may get a little bit more in the individual calf payment. This is a measure that obviously is very harsh on some of the smaller producers. A lot of smaller producers will be either using one bull, or they may even be borrowing in a bull. They may have one calving only, limited shed space, harsher weather in some of the more remote areas. We would hope that perhaps in the tier 2 measures we might see something about retaining heritage cattle or biodiversity grazing, which might mean that those smaller producers would kind of be able to claw back something in a swings and roundabouts mechanism of trying to favour people for the good work that cows do in terms of biodiversity net gains. Okay. Now, moving on to the whole farm plan. Why do we have this whole farm plan? Everyone got a letter in, if you've been putting in an IACS claim, you will have got a letter back in July where the Scottish Government said to us, the more that you understand about your farm or croft, the more productive and profitable your business can be. And the more you can contribute to Scotland's climate, biodiversity and emission targets, this is the foundation of the whole farm plan. Again, I would remind you that that came out of farmer-led climate change groups, okay? If you're claiming BPS from 2025 onwards, you will need to fulfil the whole farm plan requirements, okay? While we know that there will be no penalties for not having done 2 of the 5 elements in 2025, there will be warning letters if you're inspected and you haven't done 2 out of the 5 elements of the whole farm plan. And we are happy that that is the light touch scheme that they're introducing, but please don't take that as the cue to rest on your laurels. Take advantage of the time that is available, because by 2028, regardless of the size of your farm or croft, you are going to have to engage with the whole farm plan in its entirety for all the items that you are that you need to comply with. We also know that compliance is likely to get harder as time progresses and funding possibly less easily available. So it would be a good idea to get the bits that you can get done in an orderly fashion from here until 2028. Don't leave it until the last minute. As I said, it applies to all crofts and farms, regardless of size. Oops, have I gone? No. All crofts and farms, regardless of size. If you are claiming support payments, you will need to do a whole farm plan. The whole farm plan itself, the name is a little bit misleading. I've spoken to lots of people who have been thinking that the whole farm plan is a single plan. Instead, it is a kind of portfolio made up of 5 different audits and plans, 2 of which you'll need to complete for May 2025, and all applicable elements in place by May 2028. I would emphasise that all applicable elements in place by May 2028, because not all of you will have to do all of the plans. Okay, what you can do and what you have to do are separate things. So the plans and audits that are included in the whole farm plan are the Animal Health and Welfare Plan, an integrated pest management plan, a biodiversity audit, a carbon audit, and soil analysis. Okay. Now we'll look at each of those in a little bit more detail individually, but first of all, who needs to do what? The biodiversity audit is something that everyone is going to need to do, and you will need to review it every 5 years. The carbon audit, again, everyone will need to complete a carbon audit, and again, that will need to be reviewed once every 5 years. Soil sampling is applicable on all Region 1 land where you're using inorganic or organic fertiliser. So if you're spreading any sort of NPK compound, or if you're spreading any slurry on your Region 1 land, you do need to soil sample that, and you'll need to have soil sampled all of your Region 1 land that you are fertilising between now and 2028. And then each of your soil analysis will need to be reviewed once every 5 years. So yeah, we'll deal with a little bit more detail on that when we get to the soil sampling in detail, but it's just your Region 1 land that you are using inorganic or organic fertiliser on. The Animal Health and Welfare Plan obviously is just for livestock keepers. So you don't have livestock, you can't do an Animal Health and Welfare Plan. If you need one, it will then need to be reviewed annually. The Integrated Pest Management Plan is for those using weed control or plant protection products. So here it's worth noting that the Integrated Pest Management Plan is a little bit confusing as a term for it to begin with, because it's not really about pests, it's about weeds and parasites on plants. Again, that will need to be reviewed annually. Starting with the Animal Health and Welfare Plan, as we've said, that's for livestock keepers only. It's an annual requirement. Worth considering that the first time you do it, it's going to be a lot more complicated. If you've never done one before, it's going to take you a little bit of time. But once you've got one in place and you're reviewing it annually, it will become a lot easier. It's required for people who are keeping any number of cattle, sheep, goats, deer, alpacas, llamas, pigs, or over 350 poultry. For the whole farm plan to be compliant, it does not need to be completed or signed off by a vet. Okay. It can be signed off by a vet, but it doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be confused with your VAN number or with the options available under the Preparing for Sustainable Farming Fund. Let me specify that a little bit better. The VAN number was what was called the veterinary attestation number. Now, that was a piece of Brexit-related regulatory bump that came in December last year. And it is a veterinary attestation number that you would need to put on your Mart's chitties when you sell, and it is required for anyone who is selling into export markets going into Europe, even if the animals that you're selling, it's just the 5th quarter that's going into the export markets. So you will probably have come across the VAN number before. I know that locally here in Shetland, our vets are charging, if you're doing a VAN number with them and it's a VAN number only, if they are regularly on your property and they know your animal health and welfare standards and they're happy with them, they are charging about £20 to get that form completed and get your VAN number. If instead they have to come out and visit, they would be charging a bit more because obviously there's the visit time and travel and whatnot. But that is not an animal health and welfare plan in and of itself. That is just for exporting. You possibly all have maybe come across the Preparing for Sustainable Farming Fund as well, where there is a suite of animal health and welfare interventions where you can claim back £250 against veterinary support for things like bull fertility testing or fecal egg counts. But these in and of themselves are great. And if you're going to be doing any of those animal health and welfare interventions, absolutely you should be claiming that back on PSF. But those are not an animal health and welfare plan. They are just specific interventions that the government for the past 3 years have been trying to encourage people to do. The animal health and welfare plan is a document, a standalone document where you're going to write down a lot of the things that you're doing anyway, things like shearing and looking after feet and worming and treating for fluke and all of those different things that you do every year. The animal health and welfare plan is just a written version of what you would normally keep in your head around how you look after animal health and welfare in general. So the minimum requirements for whole farm compliance, again, this, as I've said, does not have to be signed off by a vet. You would need to complete it with the contact details of the person responsible for animal health and welfare within the business, the contact details of your veterinary practice, your local vet practice, types and numbers of each species of livestock kept, details of breeding stock and livestock born, disease risk assessment and a management plan, livestock health management calendar, so just literally a calendar saying when you would drench and when you would treat feet and that kind of thing. Your euthanasia policy, so when and how are you culling, and your fallen livestock management details. So again, how are you disposing of dead livestock? Are you burying them or are you taking them to a local waste disposal, licensed waste disposal unit? As we've said, we don't need veterinary sign-off, but a minimum requirement is also that you do need to have reasonably regular veterinary support either on your property or for your croft. I say croft because there are specific measures that are only relevant to the crofting counties. As long as your vet is happy that they have provided enough intervention to you within the last 12 months, that is enough to be compliant. For example, if you've had them out to do a VAN number for you and they've visited the property, or if they've been out for any sort of routine check, whether it be scanning or trimming feet or whatever, that's enough. It just is enough to have a vet on property in the last 12 months for whatever reason that they were there, okay? In crofting areas, crofters can also confirm one of the following: veterinary support at a township gathering, that the keeper is a member of a local flock or herd club that has regular veterinary input, or for businesses, really small businesses with less than 2 adult breeding cows or 13 breeding ewes, if they can demonstrate that the business has taken livestock to the vet practice in the past 12 months, that is also enough. Okay. How can you complete it? We've talked a lot about the fact that you don't need a vet to do it, so how can you complete it? If you're part of QMS or Red Tractor or any of the quality assurance schemes, you may well already have an animal health and welfare plan in place, which is which is Whole Farm Plan compliant. If you're not a member of QMS, you can go and visit the QMS website. And on the section QMS Cattle and Sheep Standards at qmsscotland.co.uk, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there is a free animal health and welfare template that you can download, which is already pre-structured with all the various different details and calendars and things that you need to complete. And then it's just a case of you filling in your own details. There are also lots of other online tools. Herd Plan, for example, or the Scottish Animal Health Planning scheme. You can also, of course, complete it with your vet. You may wish to do a combination of the two. A lot of people we've spoken to are filling in the QMS template themselves, and then perhaps the next time they have the vet out on property, they'll take the time to sit down and have a look at it together and check that they're on the right lines. There may also be things happening in your local area that you should look out for. I know that here in Shetland, SAC in Shetland and the Shetland Vets are currently looking at developing a locally specific animal health and welfare template to make it a lot easier for local crofters and farmers to fill in that template with things that are locally relevant. There may well be something similar going on in your own area, so do ask around, ask your local advisors, ask your local vets if there's going to be anything similar in your area, and keep your eyes peeled for that. The next one we're going to look at is the Integrated Pest Management Plan. As I've said, it's more about dealing with weeds and plant protection. What is it? It's a plan detailing your use of weed control and plant protection products and/or techniques. If, how, and when you use them, how you would evaluate which techniques and products to use, how you minimise associated risks, who's using them, and are they qualified to do so. And it just demonstrates a general awareness of best practice. You might again have an existing plan if you're part of a UK supply chain or quality assurance scheme such as Red Tractor or Scottish Quality Crops. Again, there's an online tool that exists that can be completed by the applicant, and you would review this annually. The online template is available at the Plant Health Centre website. That's there. We'll send these slides out to everyone who registered for the webinar, so you'll get a copy of these with the links on them. This is perhaps one of the items on the Whole Farm Plan that has created a little bit of contentiousness, because officially they're saying that you can only do an integrated pest management plan if you use spray or plant protection products for weeds or for parasites on your land. However, certainly at a local level, our ARPID office has told us that they would be happy for people to complete this and for it to count for their 2025 IACs, even if they're not spraying, because in a lot of our businesses, people might not be spraying every year. They may get in a contractor once every 3 or 4 years. So I would say that the best line to take on this one is that the integrated pest management plan is to be completed by those who either use these chemical products or who intend to use them, but may evaluate throughout the year on the basis of availability of product, on whether they have a level of weeds or difficulties on their property that merit using chemical treatment, when you look at the template that's available, an awful lot of the questions are not about chemical products that you would be using. They're about your general awareness of manual weed control techniques, how you would assess whether you want to remove things by hand or whether you want to spray. Just be aware that if you don't have the right qualifications to be using sprays on your property, you would need to be using a contractor to do spraying on your property. I know that there are a lot of people who perhaps are using knapsack sprayers or weed wipers. I'm not entirely sure that all of them have the appropriate qualifications to be doing so. So if you fall into a category of people who are doing a bit of spraying but not qualified to do so, if you are using an integrated pest management, if you're doing an integrated pest management plan, you would need to either consider getting qualifications and getting up to speed with where you should be, or you would need to be using a contractor. And if you have written on your integrated pest management plan that you would be using a contractor to do your spraying, the department can and will ask for a contractor license to show who you used, and that they have the right permits to be doing so. Okay. Moving on to the biodiversity audit. The biodiversity audit is another one that's caused quite a lot of confusion because it has gone through quite a drastic evolution since they started talking about the biodiversity audit. When we began looking at the whole farm plan, I think most of us were under the impression that the biodiversity audit was going to be quite a complex thing to complete, because it was going to be mapping habitats and scoring the biodiversity of those habitats. It was going to be about identifying species of different plants and flora and fauna that were on your property. There's also been quite a lot of back and forth about, is it going to be the NatureScot app or is it not going to be the NatureScot app that's used to do this? Fortunately, there has been a gradual realisation that to have a biodiversity audit done by a qualified professional on every property across Scotland is simply not feasible, neither in terms of the expertise available to do it, nor in terms of the expense that would take for most farms and crofts. So where we're at just now is that the biodiversity audit isn't really a biodiversity audit at all. It's a baseline map of habitats and features on your land. Those of you who are perhaps already in an AIC scheme, in the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme, a farm environment assessment map does not automatically meet the standards required, but it can be updated for it, okay? And I know that certainly here, I think across the country as well, the department have started sending out letters to existing participants in the agri-environmental climate schemes, notifying them that their farm environment assessment map habitats have already been uploaded onto the ARPID system. So that will make it easier for those people to go on and check that the habitats are right and add in any that are missing, rather than having to start from scratch. The habitat map that you need to do, again, does not need to be signed off by a professional advisor. It is to be done only on your permanently managed land. So everything that's on your IACS as permanent land needs to go on your biodiversity audit. Anything that's on your IACS as seasonal land, you don't need to do habitat mapping for that. There's no penalty for incorrect classification of habitats in this first year, although given the changes that the biodiversity audit has gone through, this is one of the areas where we suspect that as we move forwards, the biodiversity audit is going to be kind of ramped up and become more complex. So I would recommend possibly considering the biodiversity audit as one of your first ones to check off, because it's easy to do. You don't need to review it again for another 5 years. And we do know that possibly that's going to ramp up as we move forwards. So it's easy right now. How easy it will be in 3 years' time, we don't know. How can you complete it? There are various ways that you can complete it. If you have been part of any of the groups trialling the NatureScot app, either in 2023 or 2024, your work on the NatureScot app will not go to waste. Unfortunately, we do know that the NatureScot app does not talk to the Rural Payments and Services system. So if you have been using the NatureScot app, you will have to download your habitat maps from the NatureScot app and then upload them onto the ARPID system for your IACs. You really couldn't make it up, but that's where we're at. The NatureScot app will be more widely available, hopefully from later next year. But at the moment, it is not available to everyone. It's just available to those people who signed up for the trial groups in several areas. So if you don't have access to the NatureScot app, you can, on the LIPIS system on the Rural Payments and Services website, so if you do your own IACs, you will have access to your digital maps through the ARPID system. And if you go onto your maps on that system, there is a wee pencil that says, I think it's modify habitats or edit habitats, and you click on that and that will take you into a layer where you can click into each field and add what habitat it is. You can also either print off a copy of your IACs maps or ask your advisor or your local ARPID office to print off a copy of your maps. And you can quite literally complete this with a paper map and some crayons. Do a bit of mindfulness colouring in and mark on your map your different habitats in the different fields that you have. You can also, if you are interested in the biodiversity value of your farm or croft, or it's something that you want to do work on, be aware that under the Farm Advisory Service Specialist Plans, you can also apply for a Biodiversity Specialist Plan. Now, the Biodiversity Specialist Plan is more than you would need for the biodiversity audit currently, because it is a biodiversity audit, and it also provides advice and help and support on how you can enhance and improve the biodiversity value of your property. But it does provide also a perfectly suitable map for the biodiversity audit for whole farm plan compliance. But that's just a nice to know. What will you need to add to this map? You'll need to identify specific habitats on the map with land types, different types of grassland, woodland, moorland, wetland, etc. And any linear features or point features like dry stone dikes, hedges, bodies of water, water courses, all of those will need to be identified on your biodiversity map. To help you do that, you don't need to just make it up. On the ARPID website, there is already, if you look up biodiversity audit on the ARPID website, there is a key to all of the different habitats that they have on their habitat layer within the LIPIS system. And each of the different habitats, there's the name of the habitat and also a descriptor there to help you identify which ones are which. But it's things like semi-improved grassland, improved grassland, unimproved grassland, coastal heath, moorland, wetland, salt marshes. They're things that are reasonably easy to identify. And luckily for mapping purposes, we're not looking for a great deal of detail. We're looking to record the main habitat type in each land parcel. So within each ARPID field identifier, you're looking to map just the main habitat. You don't need, if you've got a field with a wee bit of moorland, sort of heathery bit at the top and it comes down and it's grassier and there's a wetland bit in the corner, you're just looking at what is the majority of that field. Okay, so if it's mostly semi-improved grassland, you're going to put in semi-improved grassland, and that is the job done. As we've said, this is to be reviewed every 5 years. They have really tried to make this as simple and as accessible to smaller units as possible. and as well to larger units. It really is an easy one to do, and one of the ones that I would recommend doing first if you're not sure where to start, depending on what your personal situation is. To give you an example of what the map would look like, this is an example taken from a biodiversity specialist plan that we did for a client here in Shetland. As you can see, it shows your field boundaries. It's for this client's permanent land only. It shows linear features. There are water courses mapped on there. The key also says that dry stone dikes are mapped on, but there aren't any dry stone dikes. Your habitat types, and then down here you've got your business details, so your BRN, your main location code. You've also got a grid reference of exactly where this is, or you would do here if I hadn't removed it. The Ordnance Survey grid reference just to show exactly where we're at. And you would also write on it the date that it was completed, because bearing in mind that you're going to need to review this in 5 years, it's a good idea to write down when you did it so that you can remember when you have to go back and review it again. This map, if you look carefully at it, is actually above and beyond what you need, because this field with the large area of pink heath moorland actually has in one corner down in the bottom, what is that, the bottom left corner of the field, it has an area of improved grassland. And then it has a little bit of wetland up in that top left corner. But that's all within the same field. So actually, we would only really needed to have put in heath moorland for that entire field to meet the minimum requirements. But because this was part of a biodiversity specialist plan, it's a little bit more detailed than the basic requirement. Now, moving on, carbon audit. The carbon audit is another one that needs a little bit of explanation as to what it is. It is basically just a means of measuring and recording your greenhouse gas emissions from your agricultural enterprises. It establishes what your agricultural enterprise, and I'm saying agricultural enterprise because it does do a whole farm carbon footprint, and then it will break it down. If you've got cattle and sheep, or you've got hill sheep and in-by sheep, you can use it to split that down and have a look at the greenhouse gas emissions per enterprise rather than just at the whole farm level. The idea is that it would identify the sources of your emissions and then highlight areas where you can improve your operational efficiency and potentially reduce your costs. In order to do that, we need to take into consideration all of your inputs and all of your outputs, and you put all of those numbers into a piece of software, and there are various different pieces of software tools available to do that. And the software will crunch the numbers for you, and then it will spit out at the other end a number which tells you how much you are emitting as a whole farm and how much you're emitting per kilo of output for your different enterprises. Now, depending on where you are and what kind of levels of inputs you have, this can be a useful exercise. It can also be of very limited use to you, depending on the level of inputs that you're using anyway. I know that for a lot of smaller businesses, perhaps especially in the remoter areas of the country, where inputs are markedly more expensive, there is limited scope for reducing emissions through reducing fertiliser or fuel or feed. In other areas, perhaps with bigger units, perhaps where inputs are used more liberally, there is scope for perhaps reducing your carbon footprint by re-evaluating what you're putting into your business in terms of energy, feed, fuel, etc. However, for everyone, it can be a really, really useful way of looking at your business efficiency, because when we talk about carbon efficiency measures, we're not just looking at how to reduce the inputs or how to increase the outputs. We're also looking at things like how do you redress the balance a little bit, and that's the balance of inputs to outputs, but also the balance perhaps of your own time and energy that you put into the business. It's a good chance to take a step back and look at, does what we're doing on farm make sense? Does it make sense in terms of financial sense? Does it make sense in terms of the environmental outcomes that we want? Does it make sense in terms of the lifestyle and the amount of work that we're putting into it? Is it where we want to be? And are there any things that we could do to change that? I know, again, speaking from a very local context, there are a lot of people in Shetland who are perhaps breeding larger framed sheep, and they're doing that because that's what the mass market wants. The supermarket chains want certain levels of conformity, certain sizes of animals and carcasses, and they're the animals that will go for the biggest prices in the sale ring. However, not everyone in Shetland is running through their costs and working out how much it's costing them to put that animal in the sale ring compared to how much their inputs are costing them. So this can be a really good opportunity to take that step back and think, is what we're doing working, or do we need to reevaluate where we're at and how are we going to do that? The numbers that you put into the piece of software, firstly, information about your land and crops. Most of that you can get off your IACS forum. Your land areas, and what you're using those land areas for. Then you're also going to fill in any fertilizer that you're using, lime, organic manure, manure if you're importing or exporting, that gets considered in different ways. Any chemical treatments you're using, and crop yields, of course. Livestock wise, you're looking for the numbers of livestock you have, and they're averaged over a 12-month period. So you're going to select a 12-month period, which might be your financial year, or it might be your calendar year, depending on what works best for your business. But you would need to have your livestock numbers at the beginning of that period and your livestock numbers at the closing of that period, and everything that you sold, everything that was born, everything that died within that period. And then we put that into a calculator and it works out the average over the 12-month period. You'd also be looking for average weights. That would be live weights of, for example, looking at sheep, live weights of breeding yows, depending on what breed you're using, weights at birth, weights at weaning, weights at slaughter. And those are not necessarily things you're going to be incredibly precise with. They're just looking for an average, so you will have a decent idea, or an advisor can help you depending on what breed of animals you're looking at. You'd also be looking for sort of how much are they gaining, daily weight gain across a period. Also purchases, sales, deaths, how you're managing manure, if it's spread on pasture, if your livestock are in the hill, if they're housed, how much bedding and feed are you purchasing in, and what types of bedding and feed are you purchasing in, and finally your electricity, your fuel, and your waste. Electricity can be a sticky one because many people don't have a separate meter for their farm. They might have a meter for the house and the farming buildings. So it's worth considering that you need to spend a little bit of time estimating exactly how much of your electricity is used within your business in kilowatt hours. Also your fuel, obviously your diesel, both red and white, any petrol you're using. There's also sections for liquid gas, petroleum, or kerosene, or whatever else you may be using. Any renewables that you have on property, small wind turbine, if you're using any solar or PV panels or anything like that. And then an estimate also of your waste in terms of plastic. So silage bale wrap, feed bags, containers, all of that kind of thing. And also water. There's a figure to go in for water as well. Right, so carbon audit requirements. How do you complete this? mammoth piece of spreadsheety work. If you are semi-handy with a spreadsheet, you can choose to self-complete, but you must use an approved tool which has to be approved to PAS 2050 standards. There are a variety of different tools available online. As SAC, we use AgriCalc, but there are lots of different tools available. The tool itself can create mitigation recommendations for you, but you can also currently, you can still get preparing for sustainable farming funding until the end of the year. If the carbon audit is completed by the 31st of December, you can claim back at least some of the cost under the Preparing for Sustainable Farming Fund. And through that, you would get an advisor to do it, and the advisor would provide mitigation recommendations, so things that you could change about your business to make it more carbon efficient and also at the same time more financially efficient. You should keep a note if you are self-completing, or even if you're not self-completing, keep a note of what tool you used, whether it was AgriCalc or one of the other carbon auditing tools that are available, the date you completed it, and a full record of the audit. Okay, so print a copy or save a copy on your computer and keep a hold of it, because again, if you are inspected and you have said that you've got a carbon audit as one of your 2 out of 5 for next year or in 2028, we'll all have to have them. ARPID can actually ask to see a copy of the audit itself. Again, you may already have a carbon audit, because a carbon audit is a component of a lot of different UK supply chain contracts. You may also have had a carbon audit done if you've taken part in the Farm Business Survey, or if you were part of a beef efficiency scheme in the past. You may have a carbon audit that's still in date, so check that. Okay, it must be, in order to be eligible for 2025, at 2025, May 15th, 2025, it must be no more than 5 years old. Okay. There's currently no obligation to implement the mitigation recommendations. This is a question that we're getting a lot. A lot of people are extremely concerned that once they've done a carbon audit, they're then going to have to do absolutely everything that's there in the mitigation recommendations. That is not where we're at the moment. The point of the carbon audit at the moment is to help you think about if there are efficiency measures that you can put in place. Some of the mitigation recommendations that come through on a mitigations report for a carbon audit are not necessarily going to be relevant to you. There are things that perhaps mitigation-wise sound on paper like they could be a good idea, but for a variety of reasons in real life, they may not work for you. To give you a concrete example of what I mean, again, from our own office, there are a lot of people in Shetland who obviously have quite high fuel consumption on their carbon audit. And the mitigation report would say you should assess your fuel consumption because it's quite high. If that were possible, that would be great. But the reason why a lot of Shetland crofters and farmers have high fuel consumption is because they live very far away from market, or they live very far away from where the suppliers are. So they are having to use a lot of fuel in their pickup or a lot of fuel on farm because they have land that is spread out all over the place. And so it's not practically feasible for them to reduce that fuel consumption by a massive amount. Yes, it's an important thing to think about, but it's important to think about within the art of what is doable within your business context. Okay. As I said before, there is funding available through PSF. There is also funding available for carbon audits through the Farm Advisory Service. Unfortunately, at the moment, just because there's a big backlog of people wanting carbon audits at the moment, that funding is paused for the time being, but it will be coming back. Funded carbon audits must be PAS 2050 standard. for example, done by AgriCalc and done by a verified and done by an FBAS accredited advisor who will also provide a mitigations report. If you're self-completing, you can self-complete and just get a mitigations report off the tool or use any other online resources that you want to find mitigations. But if you self-complete, you're obviously not eligible for funding support because there are not as many costs to cover. There is your time, obviously, but you don't get anything back for that. If you're looking to claim under the PSF fund, funding is available until December 2024. We do think that that is probably going to disappear after December 2024, although again, there is a lot of disagreement at the moment around, is it definitely going to disappear or is it not definitely going to disappear? I would think it probably will, but we don't have 100% certainty yet. To claim under the PSF scheme, it must be PAS 50 standard, verified, mitigations reports supplied by an FBAS accredited advisor. There's no application as such for the PSF fund, but it's a straightforward claim back process. So you would need to pay for the carbon audit and then put in a claim to claim back the costs. You can get £500 for a first carbon audit under the scheme. From what we're seeing, most carbon audits are costing a bit more than that. Depending on the size and complexity of your business, they can cost quite a lot more than that. But £500 is there to help cover the costs. The audit for PSF must be completed by the 31st of December, and you can claim it until the 28th of February 2025. Under the FAS route, as we've said, there is FAS funding available, although this is paused at the moment, but do keep an eye on the FAS website for that becoming available again. Okay, that's www.fas.scot, same website as you perhaps found this webinar on. Existing carbon audits must be valid still on the 15th of May 2025, no older than 5 years old, 3 years if they're done under PSF, but that's just because the PSF scheme ran for 3 years. Again, this one will need to be reviewed once every 5 years. Once you've done it, you don't need to think about it again for 5 years. And finally, soil analysis. Soil analysis is one of the parts of the whole farm plan that makes most sense. Soil analysis is something that you should be doing as best practice reasonably regularly. Why should you be doing it? Soil sampling and analysis provides essential information, especially, not only, but especially on the pH and the nutrients in your soil. If you don't get your pH right, often you can be wasting the nutrients that you're putting on the soil through fertilizer. And as we all know, that's a serious cost at the moment. So the pH affects the uptake of nutrients available in the soil. The analysis will support your soil nutrient management decisions. So you should be planning what you're putting on in terms of fertilizer, in terms of slurry, in terms of checking whether you need to change your fertilizer based on a sensible regime of soil sampling. At the moment with your IACs, you are required to do, if you're putting on any nitrogen or lime, you're required to do a nitrogen, lime and fertilizer plan for the year. But from 2028, nutrient planning will become mandatory for this, which means that you won't just be looking at it on a year-to-year basis, but you'll be looking at it over a slightly longer period of time, so that you are over time applying fertilizer and lime in a way that favours soil health and fertility. What do you need to sample? You need to sample all of your permanently managed Region 1 land where organic or inorganic fertiliser is being used, okay? So that is just Region 1 land where you are spreading either muck, slurry or any NPK fertiliser. And it's the permanently managed land again. Seasonal, you don't need to worry about. Again, this second point, permanently managed Region 1 land that is not fertilised can also be sampled. Obviously, you can sample anything you want. Locally, our Shetland ARPID office are saying that because it is best practice, they would be happy to accept soil analysis from people who have Region 1 land where they may be considering putting on fertiliser, but they haven't fertilised because the soil samples came back saying that they didn't really need to fertilise. So I would check locally, perhaps with your local ARPID office or with your local advisor, around whether you can use soil sampling on Region 1 land that you are not fertilising to check that box for 2025 or not. I think this is quite difficult in terms of enforcement because, again, similar to the integrated pest management plan, they're looking at enforcement based on people's intentions, which I think we can all agree is quite difficult. But technically speaking, you will need to sample everything that you are putting fertiliser on. If you're not putting fertiliser on, you do not have to sample your Region 1 land, but you can should you wish to do so. Clients can, of course, take samples themselves. And again, with the slides, when we send out the slides after, we'll send a little how-to guide as well on how to take a soil sample, but I'll run through that just now quickly as well. Slipper farmers will need to sample, and that's slipper farmers on a large scale or anyone who is claiming under alternative practices will need to take soil samples on anything that they claim as permanent land. The results on your soil analysis must include pH, pK, and soil carbon, which is done on a loss on ignition test. That again is a slightly contentious point because if you were actually looking for soil carbon, as in how much carbon the soil is sequestering, you would need to take samples from a much deeper core than we do for sampling for nutrient management. But let's not say that too loudly at the moment. Soil carbon should be included now as standard on all samples taken from 2024 onwards. But if you've done sampling pre-2024 that didn't include soil carbon, those samples will still be acceptable. It's just when you do more samples in the future, you'll need to make sure that soil carbon is also measured on your samples, on your analysis, sorry. When to sample? You can sample at any time of the year. Again, this is a question that comes up quite a lot. A lot of people want to wait until spring when they're planning their fertiliser. Take the samples now. There's not that much of a difference in how much leaches out over the winter period. So you can take them at any time in the year. Avoid sampling within 2 years of applying lime or 2 months of applying fertiliser or manure. Recommendation is to review analysis once every 5 years. And again, that is minimum once every 5 years. But if you've got fields, obviously, with particular problems and you're needing to sample them a wee bit more regularly, then absolutely you can do that. How to take the sample? It's really an easy thing to do yourself. You just need a clean bucket, a trowel, a spade, an auger if you've got one, or a lot of people use, if you've got a big old masonry drill bit, you can use a drill bit for it. That makes an excellent auger. Preferably a good day would be useful. You're looking at taking 12 to 15 cores per acre. So you're walking your field in that kind of zigzag pattern that you can see there on the diagram, avoiding any hot spots, places where you might have had a water trough or a feeding trough or gates or places where you might have stored lime in the past, anything that's going to throw the analysis off because evidently there are differences across the field. Avoid your field margins as well, because you're probably not going to have got right to the edge of the field with your fertiliser. And you're walking the field taking a core. You're looking at taking sort of the top 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches for a grazing field, the top 3 to 4 maximum inches from a silage field or a ploughed field. You're going to pop those cores into your bucket as you go, remove any sort of roots, debris, grass, and once you've walked your entire field, you're going to have a good sort of 1.5 kilos or so in your bucket. Give it a really good mix, and then pop 300 grams or so into a commoner garden freezer bag. And on that freezer bag, you are going to have written your business name, a field identifier, and what analysis you're looking for. What analysis you're looking for is just really, is it a grazing field? Is it a silage field? Are you planning any big changes with the field? Are you going to reseed it? Are you going to plough it? What's happening to it? So that anyone giving you advice knows to calibrate their fertiliser and lime recommendations based on what you're going to be using the field for. Field identifier, I would add a little note there. For your field identifier, don't put Park 1, Park 2, Park 3, Park 4, because when you look back at that in 5 years' time, you're not going to remember what fields those were. Also, don't muck about with the HU numbers. The HU numbers, if you get a land inspection, your HU numbers can change because they're just a grid reference from the centre of the field. So if you put up a new fence, your field identifiers are going to change on your IACs. So the best thing to do is write down what you actually call the field. So if you call it the Henhouse Park, write Henhouse Park on the bag. If you call it Annie's Park or field behind the house or field across the burn, write whatever you would normally call that field, so that when you look back at it in 5 or 10 years, you're going to be able to remember exactly what field that was, and you know where you're at with it, okay? You submit that to a lab. You can either do that through, I know Harpro maybe takes soil samples. We do as SAC. You can post them off to a lab yourself. Again, there's funding available through PSF. You must, in order to claim back soil analysis costs, you must have a valid carbon audit in place to claim. That can be done in the same calendar year or anytime in, I think, the 3 years previous to it. The amount of soil sampling, soil analysis support you can get, if you're taking the samples yourselves, you get about £4 per sample. If you have less than 50 hectares of Region 1 land on your SAF, there's a cap of £300 on what you can claim back in any 1 year based on actual costs. If you've got more Region 1 land on your SAF, you would be looking at 20% of that, up to a maximum of £600 at about £30 per sample, okay? So if you've got a substantial amount of Region 1 land on your property, you'd be looking at trying to sample about 20% of it every year, so that after 5 years, you're starting back at the beginning of the cycle again. If you don't have a huge amount of Region 1 land, it might be worth considering sampling everything in the first year and then not having to redo it again for 5 years. There is also, if you claim back on the PSF fund, you can also get, the first year you do it, a £250 personal development payment, which is just automatically added to all first claims. So going back to your carbon audit funding, if you were to claim for a carbon audit and soil sampling, both done before the 31st of December this year and claimed by the 28th of February next year, you would get the £500 for the carbon audit, plus the cost of your soil samples, almost all of it, depending on how much you are sampling, plus another £250, which can go towards helping cover any extra cost of the carbon audit, which may cost more than the £500, and might even leave you with a little bit of cash in your pocket rather than being out of pocket, depending on how complex your carbon audit is. Right, so that's all 5 of the different elements, what they are, what you need to do to comply with them. Here are a couple of points to consider in deciding what to do next now that you've got that information. Think about how many of the 5 are relevant to you. If you don't have livestock, you're not doing an animal health and welfare plan, so you just need to think about the other 4 and if they're relevant to you. If you're not doing any spraying and you have no intention of ever doing any, you don't need to do an integrated pest management plan. Okay. Consider, are you doing any of them already? Are you already in QMS? Are you part of any kind of quality assurance scheme? Are you subject to any of these things because you're part of a supermarket contract that requires them? Find out if you have any of them in place already. Think about when the last time you did soil sampling was. It may be more recently than you think. We've had a few clients come in going, oh yeah, we did do soil sampling, not very sure when. And then when we checked back, it was done in 2022, so will be valid for next year. It is possible to complete a lot of this yourself or within your family. Now, I think that the fact that the government has very quietly removed the obligation for a lot of this to be done by a qualified person is a little bit underhand, because it's a bit like saying to many people, you can wire your own house. Well, yes, I could, but I'm not a lunatic, so I'm not going to do that. If you have the skills to do it yourself, or if you have the skills within your family to do it, think about which bits you can do. Think about as well which bits are perhaps not sensible to do yourself and you would like support with them, and how you're going to plan to get that support, and to check if there's any funding available that could help you cover the cost of getting that support. Plan what you'll need to do to meet the 2025 deadline, but don't stop there. Think about how that's going to fit into how you're going to meet the full compliance for 2028. Okay, so what are you going to need to do over the next few years, not just for 2025, but there's going to be more that you have to do for 26, 27, and then everything in place by 2028. So think about how you're going to do that, but also don't panic and start trying to do everything for 2025, because what will happen if you do that is that in 5 years you'll have the whole lot to do all over again. It would be better to kind of stagger it over time, do a couple now, do another one next year, and move forward so that you're never going to have to review everything all at the same time, and you're spreading the workload and you're spreading the cost over the time available. Make use of that funding that's there wherever possible. There is the PSF fund. There are FAS carbon audits available. We've said they're paused at the moment, but they will be coming back. There are also the FAS specialist plans. Now you can get a specialist plan for a carbon action plan. You can get a FAS specialist plan for biodiversity, for succession planning. There are a whole range of different specialist plan options. So do have a look at the page dedicated to that on the FAS website and see if there are any of them that would be suitable for you. But above all, get advice and take action now. Don't leave it any longer. Try and get your 2 out of 5 maybe checked off before Christmas, and then you won't have to worry about it in the springtime. Food for thought. What would you do? These are a couple of different crofter scenarios. There's no real right or wrong answer to either of them, but if we have a look at crofter 1, he's got region 1 land. He doesn't spread fertilizer on it, but he does use 20-10-10 on his region 2 silage field. He has livestock, he uses a knapsack sprayer when necessary, and has none of the elements of the whole farm plan in place. To him, I would be saying perhaps get your biodiversity audit done now, and have you got sprayer ticket for that knapsack sprayer? If you do, get your integrated pest management plan done now, because that's a really easy fix. It'll take you about 15 minutes and most people will be able to do it themselves. If he doesn't have a sprayer ticket, I would tell him to get his sprayer ticket and then do his integrated pest management plan. If he doesn't have a sprayer ticket, I might be looking at doing his animal health and welfare plan this year and then deal with the rest of it as we move forwards. He doesn't have to do soil sampling. But because he is using fertiliser, I think he would be as well to do soil sampling to make sure that he's not wasting that 20-10-10 and actually needs to put more lime on than fertiliser. But he has options that he can consider. Crofter 2 has Region 1 land. She spreads fertiliser on it. She has animals. She gets a contractor in to do spraying occasionally, but usually controls weeds manually. She has a carbon audit completed in 2021, and she is in QMS. She doesn't need to do anything for next year. She's in QMS, so she'll have an animal health and welfare plan in place with that. Her carbon audit is still going to be good for 2025. She'll need to review it soon, but she's okay for 2025. So she really needs to think more about, okay, what am I going to do moving forwards from here? She'll need to start doing soil sampling at some point. So perhaps she needs to consider how much Region 1 land does she have and how and when does she need to start sampling to make sure that she has everything sampled in the last 5 years before 2028. She might want to do her integrated pest management plan as well, but she doesn't need to do that right now. She can wait until next year to do that. Okay. Thank you very much. I've gone well over the hour, but please do give us your questions if you're still there and awake.
Thank you, Osla. Take a deep breath, grab a glass of water. Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive overview. In fact, it wasn't an overview, it was an in-depth dive into the guidance and all 5 components of the plan. You'll be happy to know that I have been typing away in the background, answering as many questions as I can. You'll also be pleased to know that actually when questions came through in your next slide or sentence, you actually answered a lot of them for people, which was great. So to be honest, I'm not really going to go into the questions. We've ran slightly over time, so I'm going to give you a reprieve, Osla, and not and rest your voice for you. I think one thing I would just like to reiterate from Osla's presentation is that everybody will need to do this. It's up to each individual business, whether you see these as a tick box exercise or if you see them as an opportunity to dive further into these things. And I think, as Osla said, with the carbon audits, something like that, it's really good to get an external or just a different set of eyes onto your business that might pick up something that you might be missing. It happens with us all. So, excuse me, I really would encourage people to see them as an opportunity because I think it's here to stay. And if we see it as a drag, it's going to be a long 5 years to get these things in place and beyond. There was a few questions, Osla, which you answered, numerous times about the PSF funding. So again, I just want to back Osla up with that. We don't know if the PSF funding is going to be continued or not. It was launched in 2021 as a 3-year initiative to get farmers on board with soil sampling and on board with carbon auditing. There are bodies and people fighting for it to be continued. And there's also some opinions that it's been here for 3 years, guys. You've had the opportunity. These things might be brought in as mandatory practices for business, and unfortunately, there might not be funding in the future for them. The funding that Osla mentioned through the Farm Advisory Service has been here for years, and hopefully, yes, it will open it up and it will continue. So that funding's likely to be there, but we're unsure about PSF at the moment. And as I say, sorry, we're just out of time. So I'm just going to wrap up the webinar. I'll just share my screen again and just take you through the last couple of slides of the presentation. So I just want to make everybody aware. So as I said there about seeing some of these audits as an opportunity. So the next webinar, excuse me, part 2 will take place on the 19th of December at 7 o'clock. And that's going to be Mary Jane Lowry from our Edinburgh office is going to go into the biodiversity audits in a bit more detail. She's going to give you tips on how to take that a step further and identify habitats on your farm and look a little bit into how these can be completed on the Scottish Government website, give you a bit more insight into that. And we've also got Fiona Burnett from our crop clinic or arable specialist who's going to go into the integrated pest management plans in a lot more detail, and actually, you know, that could be a quite simple tick box exercise, but in a weed control perspective, it's also got a lot of benefits on farm for controlling weeds. So Fiona's going to go into more detail on that on the 19th. And then the final part of the series will be on 3rd of December, where we've got Megan Ferguson from SRUC Veterinary Services going into a lot more detail about the health plan, the benefits of health planning, and why every business should be seeing that as a real opportunity. So these are definitely 2 webinars to join. There's lots of good content in these as well. Also on the screen just now are the FAS helpline information details. So there's the phone number, the email, and obviously the website. Any questions you have on any of tonight's content, if it's to do with the specialist advice plans or any of the audits, please feel free to contact the Farm Advisory Service, and somebody will get back to you and answer your questions. And anybody that's been on a FAS website before, you'll know that you get the email afterwards to fill out some feedback, and there's a link down at the bottom of the presentation there. We'd be really, really grateful if you could complete that feedback for us. It helps us design the programme going forward. One other thing, Osla, a few people have asked for a copy of your presentation. So we'll be able to send your slides out through a PDF version after the webinar, is that correct?
Absolutely, yep.
Yes, yep. So everybody that's joined tonight, we'll get a version of Osla's presentation emailed over to you tomorrow morning, so that you've all got the slides. So I would just like to thank.
It may not be tomorrow morning, but it will be soon.
Oh, we'll get that sorted. We'll get that sorted. Thank you.
And my contact details are on there as well. If anybody has burning questions that we didn't deal with tonight, then please do get in touch.
As I say, hopefully I've answered the majority of them, but yeah, if any have been missed, then please feel free to contact Osla or the FAS helpline, and we'll get those answered. So there's been a lot of people on tonight. Thank you very, very much for your attendance. Thanks for joining, and thanks to Osla for such a great presentation.
You're very welcome.
We will close the webinar there. So thank you everybody for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.